So thank you everyone for coming today. Mind the brief delay. So there are a few of you in the room that have seen one of my presentations on this topic before, somewhere in the world. I now work for Salesforce, so there are many things that I would have said before that I will probably not be saying today, and making sure are not on that video back there. My name's Stephan. Originally born and raised in California, but have been in the UK for 7 years. I'm a cloud architect at Salesforce in the UK, specializing in platform and security architecture for Salesforce. I have been fascinated with data protection and privacy for a very long time. Setting the stage, if we think back about 12 years, there was no Facebook, there was no social media, and I was just a young boy working in customer service for a gym in the middle of nowhere in California. Now, this gym happened to be owned by a hospital, which meant that everything we did was governed by HIPAA regulation in the US, which is a very stringent healthcare regulation, part of which applies to the data that's transferred and collected by any medically based facilities. One evening, this random guy comes up to the customer service desk, scans his membership card, and asks me to verify some of the information on his account. Me not really doing any due diligence, just said, yep, this is the address we have, this is the phone number. And he says, oh, well, those aren't correct. What name do you have on file? And I said, oh, yeah, this is your name. And he said, oh, thank you very much for that. Someone broke into my car yesterday and dropped this membership key on the floor of my car, and you've just given me his address, phone number, and I'm going to go and find him. Well, obviously that breaks the HIPAA regulation massively, because I've taken this personal data and unknowingly given it away to someone who is probably going to go and find him and kill him, or who knows, God knows what he's going to do. But the regulators weren't happy. We had to go through the formal process of filing a complaint and doing all of that just because I looked at the computer screen, made a couple of clicks, and gave away some information. And it was that simple 12 years ago for me to just do that. Now, a lot of businesses nowadays find themselves in the same scenario. Systems are digital, everything's online in the cloud, and we have even easier access to all of this personal data. So we need to make sure that we're using it in a proper way. Now, quick forward-looking statement. This is the first time I'm getting to say this to a public audience, so that's a bit cool. Anything that I say today about our products and some of the features that are in beta within Salesforce should not be influencing any buying decisions that you make. And please make sure you check out the release notes to see when those features become available to make your buying decisions. So a couple of years ago, we were talking about the GDPR, how this big thing was coming, and how it's going to really change the game in the way that we respect and use data in Europe. But what we didn't realize was that it would actually have some relevant trimmers globally. We've got the California Consumer Privacy Act that's coming into play in the new year. We've got some things going on in Nevada. And globally, we're starting to see sort of a shift in the way that people are thinking about data and using it. Now, to combat this, Salesforce have released a set of standard functionality to tackle that problem. And the approach they've used is that in order to create a seamless, unified profile of someone based on their preferences, you need to have a unique view of that person. And a lot of us know Salesforce released the individual object a couple of years ago as sort of the first phase towards these privacy and data governance objects, and have made use of it in some ways, some not so much, because it can be difficult to implement and deduplicate your records across the system. But the idea generally is that we've got a load of people within Salesforce. We've got maybe someone who's a user, someone who might be a community user, we've got leads, we've got contacts, and that single person may have 5 or 6 personas within an org, if not more. And the individual is meant to unify those personas and to be their true identity within the application, and thus preferences should be managed against that unified identity, because those people are all representative of that same person. They're all that one person in reality, so we should be able to filter them down to a single individual. Now, in practice, that does take some complex work on your end as a developer to implement that, but every business will have its own ways of matching that and their own rules for the ways that which they would like to process that. So we've just given you a framework of objects to manage that. Now, who was aware that live in their orgs now are a set of consent objects? Does anyone know? It was quite quiet around that. Yes, we've got a few of them in the org. And so Salesforce kind of really quietly rolled this feature out in Spring 19, where we now have a set of consent objects in our org. So we've got our contact point type consent, our data use purpose, and our legal basis standard objects. Now, you'd be happy to know that all of these have unlimited data storage, as their standard objects and are great places for us to store consent because obviously we are going to have high data volumes in some of those cases. Now, like I said, what you see here is we've got our contact, our lead, and user by default that relate to the individual object. And then we now have our contact, point, type, consent, our data use purpose, and our legal basis that roll up to the individual. Move that out of the way. So to break those down, really, our contact, point, type, consent is almost like what you would call a subscription. That record, as it exists, attaches to the individual and then is attached to a data use purpose for which you've outlined, which would be maybe a subscription, a newsletter subscription, using that data in Facebook custom audiences. When we talk about some of the modern privacy regulations, they all talk about having a purpose for processing someone's data. That's what this data use purpose and this contact point type consent is. That contact point type consent is what actually grabs that purpose and attaches it to that individual, which then inherently rolls up to your individual object and to those contacts, leads, and users. Now, each data use purpose itself has a legal basis for which you're executing that. We'll go through and look at the objects in a minute and look at how they work in Salesforce and how you can take advantage of them. Now, in the summer release, they've released another set of objects called the authorization form consent, the authorization form text, and the authorization form itself. Now, what this is a digital representation of maybe your privacy policy, your terms and conditions, and capturing that message in time when a contact or lead agreed to it. So in a very similar way to that contact point consent type, we have our authorization form consent, and that sits on the individual record as well, and then allows you to attach that to a specific version of your privacy policy that was in practice when they executed that agreement. And so if we look at that in the grand scheme of things, and the authorization form also can link to a data use purpose. So if a data use purpose, like use of data for Facebook custom audiences, needs to reference that authorization form data use, it can go ahead and you can link those together for reference purposes, but it doesn't necessarily reflect the transaction when you're storing that data onto a record. And when we look at that all together, you can almost think of the authorization form objects and the contact point consent types as sitting next to each other, but not necessarily in that same transaction. They both live parallel, they both serve a similar purpose, but for those two different things. Obviously, the authorization form for capturing that document, and for the contact point type to capture that actual consent. So how do you put this in practice? I gave myself the challenge when I joined Salesforce to try and have an easy way to actually visualize this and solve this problem. And the idea is really when you land on a contact or lead page, you need to be able to know what you can do with that data. And so we need to go back, we need to query for the individual object that's related to it. We need to find out what permissions exist on that individual object. And then we need to then surface those onto the contact and lead record based on the record that you're living on. Secondly, if an individual doesn't exist, we need to be able to create it. And so we need to know to go and create an individual so that we can then start processing those records within Salesforce. And what came up with that, and I'm really excited to announce, is my very first Salesforce Labs app called Consent Capture. And Consent Capture is an app that allows you to visually see those subscriptions that live through the individual from your contact or lead records, as well as create new records and create that individual for you when you get to that page. So it is not through security review at the moment, but the listing is live if you wanted to check this out. Have a look at a beta version of it, but just know that that will be changing over the next couple of weeks before that's put live onto the App Exchange. But today I'm going to show you how it works, show you how to create some of these objects, and then actually put it into practice. So starting out in Salesforce, the first thing we need to do is if we navigate to our Consent Capture app here, we need to go ahead and create some records. So in our first instance, everything starts with a legal basis. So we need to have our legal basis set up within our Salesforce org. Now, all it consists of is a name and a description, and the only requirement really is a name. And so we're going to go ahead and call this one consent, because that's the standard legal basis that we see used quite frequently. Now, the next one that everyone talks about is legitimate interest. We're going to save that. And then lastly, let's just put in here a contract. Okay? And what we've just done is we've quickly created 3 legal bases within our org for which we then can process data. So now if we go into our data use purpose, I can go ahead and let's create one. So the common one would be a marketing subscription. So So we can create a marketing subscription here. And we're going to go ahead and select one of our legal bases, and we can select consent there. And let's go ahead and let's do Facebook custom audiences as well. And we can say we'll put that through as legitimate interest. Okay, so I've just created 2 data use purposes and 2 legal bases within our org. Obviously, this is something that would probably be dictated by legal within your organization, but in this instance, we'll go ahead and put those there. Now, when we go onto our contact record, I'm going to go ahead and pop into a contact. Consent capture itself is a flow template, so you can clone that out to build out a flow to put onto your pages. But for today, I'm going to go ahead and just edit our page, and we're going to drop that flow on there. Okay, and then we just pass the record ID variable into that. Let's put some consent capture. And save that. Now, I've put a set of starting instructions here for the user, but as it's a flow template, you can always go in, update the steps, and remove some of the screens that we've applied as standard so that the functionality is customizable for your organization. Now, if we go ahead and click Next here, you will see we have no individual object created for this, so we're going to go ahead and create an individual record. Okay, and then we can move on, and we can actually go and see what we have here available to use. So we've set up our legal bases as consent, legitimate, interest in a contact, and generally this will go through and help the user create a consent record based on the interaction they're having with someone, whether that's on the phone or online. And so we can see here, move through the different types of consent. We can say, for this instance, we will do marketing subscription. We're going to say that they're going to give consent for marketing via their email. We can then have that be valid for a set number of months. Once again, also configurable within the flow. I'm going to say they've opted into that. Lastly, you are required to give how this was captured. And then by selecting Next, that will create our contact point type consent record. And you can see here now, we can go through and we can see which valid contact point types we have within the org. And we've got that marketing subscription record there. You can go through and create as many of these as you like and just get that going within the org. And I just wanted to give you a quick overview of how those objects work, see how you can put them into practice. Obviously, this is quite basic way of using the objects, but I'm sure you can think of many ideas that these could be applied within practice. And thank you very much.